Millions of fans feel they know Dick Van Dyke from the outgoing characters he's played. But in fact, even those closest to him admit they don't know him at all.
Nobody knows him. He's not only hard to get to know, nobody really knows him. Nobody.
There's a shell, and I think it pretty much covers him.
The intriguing story of Dick Van Dyke is one of a private man driven to perform. After years toiling away on radio shows and in lounge acts, his call from the network finally came. But success was elusive, and stardom seemed a distant dream. It took a surprising role on Broadway to bring him to the TV show that would make history.
There is nothing that he can't do as a performer. I mean, he sings, he dances, he's a great comedian.
Yet in the years that followed, building on his television achievements proved difficult.
It was a good movie, and I don't know why pictures work or don't work.
And privately, there was a personal demon.
At certain times at around 5 o'clock, he would draw martini glasses on his script while we were having notes or something like that.
He hadn't remembered, he had totally blacked out, that he had turned his car over on the way home, walked home the rest of the way.
I think at one point that I was in treatment for alcoholism and had kind of publicly said, you know, that I was.
In the coming hour, we will reveal the personal story of an intensely private man.
I was very surprised when Marge and Dick broke up, actually.
You'll see rare footage and hear exclusive interviews with family, friends, colleagues, and co-stars.
We're two wounded people, I think.
He's successful and doesn't want to talk about it.
And throughout the hour, this television icon will help sketch his own story.
And then suddenly you find out that a body of work has had a positive impact on people. It's a wonderful feeling. But it's kind of a surprise to me.
This is Celebrity Profile. The Dick Van Dyke story begins in tiny West Plains, Missouri, on the Arkansas border 250 miles southwest of St. Louis. Van Dyke was born in this hospital 2 weeks before Christmas, 1925. His parents had just arrived from their hometown, Danville, Illinois. Van Dyke's mother, Hazel, was a homemaker. His father, Loren, called Cookie because he worked for the Sunshine Biscuit Company, was a traveling salesman and the life of the party.
Everything struck him funny. And he was able to, he couldn't perform. The minute he got up in front of people, he froze. He was only that way, you know, in his daily life. But and my mother was a funny woman, too.
Thanks to Cookie's job transfer, the Van Dykes soon were back in Danville. By the time Dick entered grade school, his parents had presented him with a baby brother, Jerry, who would become a talented performer in his own right. Dick denies there was ever a sibling rivalry.
No, the age difference was too great. 5.5 years, you know.
You know, if we were closer in age, it may have been rivalry, but I wasn't doing anything to compete with him.
A town of just 30,000, Danville nevertheless produced a group of high-achieving entertainers. The so-called Danville Five include the Van Dyke brothers, actor Gene Hackman, entertainer Donald O'Connor, and musician Bobby Short.
Dick's family lived on the north end of town where my family lived. We were all in the same schools. Well, Dick and I were in the same grade school, Old Garfield School in Danville.
Much of Van Dyke's childhood was spent in this house on Hazel Street. Schoolmate Henry Schaus remembers a lanky, likable youngster.
Tall, skinny kid that, like I told you, he had to carry bricks in his back pocket to keep strong winds from blowing him away.
Van Dyke's early years were spent in a Corn Belt town right out of Norman Rockwell. Times were tough for the family, but the Van Dyke brothers didn't know it.
The worry about money was constantly dinner table conversation. I knew that everybody was kind of in the same boat, but both Jerry and I have said we didn't realize that we were poor. I mean, our lives were very happy.
Neighbor Dick Blair has known Van Dyke all his life.
He was kind of by himself, you know, a loner, but he was one great guy.
Billy Carter Walfeld performed with him in Danville's high school a cappella choir.
He was not a cut-up. He was not a clown. He was pleasant, don't get me wrong, you know.
Dick was popular enough to be elected Danville High's junior class president. and was a leader with the dramatic club. Teacher Dorothy Sturm Dunsing helped cast him in student productions.
I knew Dick through his great ability, which was so evident when he was in high school. He's always had that beautiful speaking voice.
He was one of the pets of our dramatic coach. Mary Lee Miller was crazy about Dick Van Dyke. He was so versatile.
Van Dyke performed on this auditorium stage, as Lois Schaus vividly recalled.
The assemblies, the all-school parties, everything that went on, Dick was always involved. He was good at magic. He was good at singing. He could dance with no training.
Another member of the dramatic club eventually married Dick Van Dyke. Her maiden name was Marjorie Terrell Willett, and as Van Dyke described in this 1964 interview, they first saw each other at a Sadie Hawkins dance.
The only night of the year when the women invite the men and foot the bill and everything,
Right.
and the only dance at which the women can cut in on the men. You know, the girls can cut in on the boys, and that's how I met my wife. She cut in on me.
Marjorie, I knew very, very well. She was a darling girl.
She was a great gal, just, you know, vivacious and pretty.
But it was wartime. Within the year, Van Dyke put everything on hold and enlisted in the Army. Byron Paul, a special services corpsman who organized troop entertainment, met Van Dyke in a latrine. It was an unlikely place to start a career.
We're both standing there, and he just hands me this script and says, read this. Funniest audition I ever did.
When Celebrity Profile continues, a very rare look at Van Dyke's early career.
And I kind of learned that. If you can perform for drunks, you can perform for anybody.
Later, a TV classic struggles to find an audience.
And then we saw the ratings, and yes, I was terribly nervous. I mean, panicked.
At the tail end of World War II, Army Air Corpsman Dick Van Dyke and fellow corpsman Byron Paul were entertaining troops on radio and in GI stage shows in Texas. At war's end, Van Dyke returned home to Danville, unsure of his next move. He worked briefly in advertising. He returned to the microphone at WDAN, where he'd been a disc jockey in high school, and he took to performing with the local theater troupe. One night, Danville native Phil Erickson approached Van Dyke about becoming his new partner in a novelty nightclub act. He told Van Dyke he was leaving immediately for California.
And I want to know if you're interested in going with me. There was a slight pause, and Dick said, "What time will you pick me up?" And that was the beginning.
In a 1964 interview, Van Dyke recalled the life-changing decision.
Neither one of us intended to stay in the business. We always thought, well, you know, we'll go back to college and finish our education, but we wanted to knock around the country a little bit.
As the Merry Mutes, they combined pantomime with lip-syncing. Erickson had to teach the act to his new and very green partner, but the gifted Van Dyke was a quick study.
He had a comedic sense that I never really had. He was the clown of the act. He could make better faces and be funnier than I could ever hope to be.
Cocktail lounge acts were very big in those days, back in the late 40s. Almost every cocktail lounge had an act. So we always worked. And I kind of learned that. If you can perform for drunks, you can perform for anybody.
For 8 years, the Merry Mutes crisscrossed the country, from the Georgian Room in Santa Monica to the Olympia Theater in Miami. In one routine, they lip-synced to a Bing Crosby Mary Martin record. In the middle, they switched costumes and voices. They recreated the routine in a 1986 reunion performance. In 1948, while playing a club called the Zephyr Room in Los Angeles, Van Dyke decided he wanted to marry Marjorie Willett, whom he'd known since high school.
The radio broadcast called Bride and Groom was broadcast from that hotel. And the MC and the producer used to come in and see our show once in a while. And I just dropped one night that, you know, it was about time I got married. He said, "You'll do it on Bride and Groom," which we did. We got a free honeymoon, some furniture, you know, appliances, that kind of thing.
In Atlanta in 1949, the Merry Mutes were hired to host an hour-long show in the fledgling medium of television. This golf routine was among some of their prepared bits. But most of the time, Van Dyke would start writing The Daily Show at 9 a.m. They went live at 1 in the afternoon. Sometimes Van Dyke worked solo.
I read the newspaper. I sang songs. I talked to people off the street. I did everything I could think of, told jokes, and somehow filled that hour.
Dick and Marge Van Dyke's first two children, sons Christian and Barry, were born in Atlanta. But the Merry Mutes were still touring, as Barry Van Dyke remembered.
I loved plopping into new places. We had big pillowcases we kept all our toys in. We go in the hotel, dump it out. When it's time to go, we packed up our pillowcase, threw it over our shoulder, got back in the station wagon, and moved on.
In 1954, the Atlanta-based Merry Mutes broke up the act when Van Dyke was recruited by a New Orleans TV executive.
He talked me into coming down there for no more money. I had 2 kids at the time. My wife was pregnant with the third, and I don't know why we did that. But it was a great experience. I was only there 6 months before I had a chance, through Byron Paul, to go to CBS.
By 1955, Van Dyke's old Army buddy Byron Paul was working at CBS as a director. He'd seen the Merry Mutes perform in New York City and convinced CBS to sign the well-traveled comedian for 7 years at $20,000 a year, double what he'd been making. After nearly a decade of struggle, Dick and Marge Van Dyke thought they'd hit the lottery.
My wife and I walked down Fifth Avenue one day buying each other things. A pair of shoes, a scarf. First time we'd ever had any money to play with.
CBS installed Van Dyke on The Morning Show alongside newsman Walter Cronkite, but the ratings were dismal. The network then deployed him in less than favorable assignments.
I did game shows. I did what was it, Heckle and Jekyll cartoons.
And that's my earliest recollection of seeing him on TV. Was Dad's on a cartoon show today at like 3 o'clock, and we'd watch.
By now, Van Dyke was the father of 3. Daughter Stacy had come along in 1955. But in 1958, 3 years into his 7-year contract, CBS fired him.
I was petrified. I was scared to death because I had moved my family to New York, and I didn't know what I was going to do next. And I got a show with ABC called Mother's Day, which came from the Latin Quarter, a very low-budget game show. Diaper changing contest, egg frying contest, that kind of thing. And I was not very good at it either. Yeah, it was a low point during that.
Professionally, Dick Van Dyke was at a crossroads. When Celebrity Profile continues, making history.
How's your white satin evening gown?
Fine. How's your red flannel bathrobe?
I said, what's a Dick Van Dyke?
And later, a very different side of Dick Van Dyke. By 1959, 33-year-old Dick Van Dyke was at a career low. None of his TV projects, mostly game shows, had panned out. He spent his time making TV guest shots and auditioning for stage roles. Then he heard about a new Broadway musical to be directed by stage legend Gower Champion.
I went and auditioned for that. And to my amazement, got the job on the spot from Gower Champion. I couldn't believe it. I got up and did Once in Love with Amy and a little soft shoe, and he gave me the job. I couldn't believe it.
The show was Bye Bye Birdie, and in 1960, Van Dyke won a Tony Award playing a songwriter in the campy send-up of the Elvis Presley phenomenon. The next year, television writer-producer Carl Reiner and his executive producer Sheldon Leonard were looking for someone to star in their sitcom about a TV comedy writer. Reiner had written the part for himself, but decided to recast the role with someone else.
And Johnny Carson was mentioned. I mentioned him, and Sheldon Leonard luckily mentioned Dick Van Dyke, and I went to New York to see him, and of course, the rest is history.
In New York, they saw Van Dyke in Bye Bye Birdie and were impressed.
He was very different as far as his background, his environmental influences, his religious preferences, and however, we were both born in the same era, and we knew the same things, and we laughed at the same things, and we had a very similar take on what is funny in the world.
Then came the critical choice of someone to play Rob Petrie's wife, Laura. They'd looked at hundreds of prospects when the show's other producer, Danny Thomas, remembered a young actress he'd met a year earlier. Her name was Mary Tyler Moore.
He came in and read with me, And there again, I was just madly in love, a huge crush on Dick Van Dyke from the things I had seen him do. So I was really fluttery and not in control at all, but it worked. They could see that there was a rightness about the two of us.
I've always said we would have made a great improvisational team because we literally could read each other's minds. I knew and she knew what we were going to do next.
The producers continued casting with veteran performers like Rose Marie.
I said, oh, is this for Danny Thomas? You know, she says, no, this is a new show called The Dick Van Dyke Show. I said, what's a Dick Van Dyke?
Van Dyke left Bertie behind and moved Marge and their 3 kids to Los Angeles. 9-year-old Barry Van Dyke remembered the culture shock that awaited them.
I just remember being thrilled that I was coming, you know, palm trees and sports cars. We couldn't believe the different cars. I remember coming out and seeing Porsches everywhere. We never saw a Porsche back, you know, on Long Island or in New York.
Also in 1961, Marge gave birth to their 4th child, Carrie Beth. And on October 3rd, viewers first heard what would become one of the most famous theme songs in TV history.
The Dick Van Dyke Show.
Mary Tyler Moore recalled shooting the pilot as a happy, frantic blur.
As soon as I went out on the stage and began my scene with Dick, I lost all the stage fright that I had.
How's your white satin evening gown?
Fine. How's your red flannel bathrobe? What kind of a greeting is that?
We have been invited to Alan Brady's penthouse apartment to mingle with rich people.
When?
Tonight. Do whatever it is you do with your face, and I'll go see if I got a clean shirt.
Rob and Laura Petrie reflected perfectly the optimism of the Kennedy era. They were young, energetic, bright, and yes, a little neurotic.
But then how do you know he's sick?
Well, there are symptoms.
What symptoms?
Well,
Come on, I'm the boy's father.
he turned down his cupcake.
While TV audiences could relate to the Petries, too few people were watching.
And then we saw the ratings, and yes, I was terribly nervous. I mean, panicked, because I had felt at a very early stage of that experience that it was my family.
Unfortunately, I bought a house out here and everything, and then at the end of the first season, the show was canceled. So once again, it was panic time.
What is it, honey?
Well, a telegram just arrived for you.
All right, you have my permission to open it and read it.
All righty.
But when ratings picked up during summer reruns, executive producer Sheldon Leonard grabbed the opportunity and lobbied successfully to save the show. By late 1962, it was a bona fide hit and was as much fun to make as it was to watch.
Sheldon Leonard used to come down and say, "The otters are at play." He said we looked like a pond full of otters. It was never quiet. It just, we laughed all day long.
Cast and crew marveled at Van Dyke's inventiveness.
He would get up and do things on the show and during rehearsal, and we'd laugh like crazy. We just thought it was wonderful, you know. And he'd say, "Is that funny?" He'd say, leave it in, you know. So, as I say, I don't think Dick knows how much talent he has.
Bill Persky and his partner Sam Denoff joined the show as writers in the 3rd season.
Dick Van Dyke is the kind of an actor whom writers say, I can't wait till he sees the script, and we can't wait to see what he does with it.
In 1963, Dick Van Dyke made his film debut, reprising his Broadway role in Bye Bye Birdie. The sudden acclaim changed the daily lives of the very private Van Dykes. Autograph seekers made family outings to Disneyland impossible.
Around my own little neighborhood, I was fine, you know, nobody paid any attention to me. But if I would go out of town to New York or somewhere, it was just amazing at getting mobbed like that. And I didn't mind it, but I think there's something that gets old pretty quick.
As a couple, the Van Dykes seemed very happy, according to Janet Leigh, Dick's co-star in the film version of Bye Bye Birdie.
I got the feeling that they were very much on the same plane. They loved their family, they loved their children. It seemed, as an outsider, very happy together, this kind of family.
Bye Bye Birdie was a perfect prelude to Van Dyke's triumphant homecoming. March 16, 1963 was Dick Van Dyke Day in Danville, Illinois. In a way, the event echoed the film. Famous star thrills a small town. Only this was Van Dyke's own hometown. Back then, WDAN reporter Bill Pickett was a 13-year-old newsboy.
It's the largest crowd I've ever seen in downtown Danville. I mean, it was just jam-packed, wall-to-wall people. And I remember Dick coming through the downtown area in a convertible.
What especially pleased the people of Danville were all the references to it in the Dick Van Dyke Show. Jerry Van Dyke played Rob's brother in occasional appearances.
When did the midnight stroll start again?
Well, it's about a week ago. And it's funny because I haven't walked in my sleep since I was 14. Back in Danville, remember, Rob?
Yeah, you mean when you got up and took the bus to Chicago?
Yeah.
In 1963, Dick Van Dyke lost his first chance for an Emmy Award.
Well, there wasn't any comedy category.
There wasn't.
I lost to E.G. Marshall the first year because there was no comedy category. Now there's a
serious?
comedy. Yeah.
There wasn't a comedy category?
There was no comedy category.
You were just lead actor.
Lead actor, period. That was it. So I lost to the Defenders.
When Celebrity Profile continues, the fruits of stardom.
I don't believe this.
Making movie history, and later, trouble on the horizon.
At certain times at around 5 o'clock, he would draw martini glasses on his script while we were having notes or something like that.
In 1963, Dick Van Dyke lost the Emmy for lead actor because the awards didn't distinguish between comedy and drama. But the rules changed in '64, and Van Dyke triumphed as lead actor in a comedy series.
I don't believe this. Of course, everybody, I'm sure, in our industry and in the public who watches the show knows that I did it all alone. That just having the most talented writer in the business, the most beautiful and talented leading lady in the business, the most talented supporting players, the best director in the business didn't help me at all. I did it all myself. Thank you.
The Dick Van Dyke Show produced many classic TV moments. One was a Twilight Zone parody called It May Look Like a Walnut. In it, Rob has a paranoid nightmare in which everyone, even Laura, is an evil alien surviving on water and walnuts. In public, Dick Van Dyke was the very picture of a warm, engaging man. But in private, he held most people at an emotional arm's length.
He's not only hard to get to know, nobody really knows him. Nobody. Anybody says they do are wrong. You know, to really get to know him, you're not going to get it done.
Talking about not really knowing Dick Van Dyke, his canvas dressing room was right next to mine. And I could hear every word that came from his dressing room. And one show night, I remember in particular that individually people would come to him and he'd say, "Hi, nice to see ya." And this happened about 4 or 5 times. And then I heard one and he said, "Hi, nice to see ya." And it was Marge. It was Marge Van Dyke. And I thought that was an important part of what Dick is. There's a shell, and I think it pretty much covers him.
But it was Van Dyke's on-screen persona in films like 1964's Mary Poppins that solidified his reputation as a versatile actor, dancer, and singer. Richard and Robert Sherman wrote the score.
Dick Van Dyke is one of the great lucky breaks of our life, that we had the great good fortune to have a superb artist like Dick Van Dyke.
And he gave us one of our Oscars.
As Bert the Chimney Sweep, Van Dyke nearly stole the musical fantasy from Julie Andrews, and he further impressed fans in a second role as a crusty old banker. After years of struggle, Van Dyke was now an established star and was working non-stop.
So as a family, we didn't get to do, there was no Little League or anything like that that he could be involved in, because he was constantly working. His career took all of it, all of his time. We got to go, our vacations were locations.
Van Dyke and his TV series continued to rack up Emmys. In 1965, Jerry Van Dyke accepted on his brother's behalf. The next year, the 40-year-old Van Dyke was able to make the awards to accept his 3rd consecutive Emmy victory.
That little group of people down there,
table know how gratified I am to them to get this and how much I owe them.
It was also his final Emmy for the Van Dyke Show. After 5 years and 158 shows, creator Carl Reiner was pulling the plug.
By the 5th year, when we decided that we wanted to go on to move on to other things, there was a lot of crying.
But Rosemarie remembers it a little differently, including a private conversation she had about Van Dyke with executive producer Sheldon Leonard.
I said, well, what's wrong? He says he doesn't want to do another year. He wants to do movies. And then I think Carl said, well, we don't want to run dry. You know, we'll finish up on top.
I didn't want it to end. I so loved those people.
Afterward, Van Dyke made a series of well-received specials, including one with Mary Tyler Moore. His real interest, however, remained a movie career. But too often he chose badly, appearing in his share of forgettable vehicles. One bright spot was Chitty Chitty Bang Bang, a 1968 musical fantasy. The next year came one of Van Dyke's biggest professional disappointments. He'd had high hopes for Carl Reiner's bittersweet comedy, The Comic. As the fictional silent film comedian Billy Bright, Van Dyke found both laughs and heartache.
It had a sadness to it, and the truth about it, that was very sad. It was a good movie, and I don't know why pictures work or don't work.
I think it ran for 2 days and disappeared. It got no promotion.
The Comic was important to Van Dyke in part because of his lifelong admiration for silent film giant Stan Laurel. Van Dyke had befriended his idol, whom he impersonated here in the early 1960s, when Laurel was living in obscurity.
I called the number and said, is this Mr. Laurel and Hardy? Yes. I told him who I was, and he had seen the television series that year, and he knew who I was, and I invited me to come over that Sunday. And the first thing I said to him on the phone was, I said, you know, I've stolen a lot from you over the years. And he said, I know. Very sweet gentleman.
In 1971, Van Dyke moved to a ranch in the Arizona desert. He was in semi-retirement, but out driving one day, he spotted a studio being built nearby.
So that got me to thinking, you know, I could have the best of all possible worlds if I worked it right. And I'd asked CBS about it. They said, fine. And we got going.
Thus, in 1971, was born the new Dick Van Dyke Show. Van Dyke called on old friend and colleague Carl Reiner.
So I said I'd write the pilot, and I directed the first 7 shows, I think. And the pilot I wrote was one that I had to make them forget that he was forever tied to Mary Tyler Moore, tied to Laura.
Hope Lang was cast as his wife.
He never made you feel that you were working with a, quote, star.
In the 3rd season, Van Dyke and Reiner had a falling out with CBS. At issue, a script the network considered risque, but Van Dyke and Reiner strongly believed in. When CBS wouldn't budge, they finished the season and pulled the plug themselves. When Celebrity Profile returns, dark times for Dick Van Dyke.
I knew that it had too strong a hold on me, and I recognized that in Dick.
By 1973, 47-year-old Dick Van Dyke was back living in Los Angeles when he was cast against type in the TV movie The Morning After, about a white-collar alcoholic. At first, producer Stan Margulies had no idea how close to home the story was for the actor.
And Larry Terman and I went and met with him, and the astonishing first sentence was, "How did you guys know so much about me?"
Van Dyke's own drinking could be traced back at least as far as the early 60s. After they shot Bye Bye Birdie, co-star Janet Leigh recalled Van Dyke's traffic accident after cocktails at her house.
I don't know that there was a lot of PR about this because it didn't involve another car. It was that he had just missed a turn or something like that.
Back then, drinking usually was a source of humor, especially on the Dick Van Dyke Show. Off camera, no one recognized a problem.
I don't ever recall him not showing up. I don't ever recall him getting surly or nasty. I mean, I'm sure you'll hear this too. At certain times at around 5 o'clock, he would draw martini glasses on his script while we were having notes or something like that. But it never seemed to be an issue.
I never knew he was as big a drinker as he was until he himself admitted. The only thing that happened to Dick when he drank is he got more open, funnier. He talked to people more. He was more verbal.
Of course, we were both drinking, and you know, we became close during those times. But the next day, it was back to distant again. I've never able to get to him.
Mary Tyler Moore, who won her own war with alcohol, has admitted they were all big drinkers in those days. But in hindsight, she could see Van Dyke's problem.
Because in the back of my mind, I think I knew about myself, and I knew that it had too strong a hold on me, and I recognized that in Dick.
Writer-producer Sam Denoff was astonished when Van Dyke described the morning after a binge while working on the new Dick Van Dyke Show.
And he looked down the road and he saw sun glinting off a windshield or something. And he said, oh my God. And he walked down and he saw there his car was in a ditch upside down. He hadn't remembered, he had totally blacked out, that he had turned his car over on the way home, walked home the rest of the way.
In the morning after, Van Dyke gave a shattering performance as Charlie Lester, a speechwriter and family man consumed by drinking.
You think you can stop me from drinking if I want to drink?
We didn't broadcast that he had these problems. We simply said he was interested in the script and wanted to do it. I think very few people knew that it was a personal battle.
For audiences used to the happy-go-lucky Dick Van Dyke, the film opened a lot of eyes.
As people always seem a little surprised when a comedian or a comedic actor proves to be a good dramatic actor.
Van Dyke, who received an Emmy nomination, fought to retain the film's downbeat ending and is proud of the movie.
That movie's been used in treatment centers all over the United States because it shows what can happen, not to a Skid Row bum, but to a middle-class guy with a family.
In real life, hospitalization didn't help. Finally, Van Dyke turned to prayer and personal discipline and took his last drink in 1978. He worked in television throughout the 70s, but the turmoil continued. His 30-year marriage to Marge broke up in 1978. Many who knew the couple were stunned.
It did surprise me, and you know, in retrospect, I wonder if the drinking had something to do with it. That I can't answer.
I thought they really were in love, as well as the loving parents of their children. But again, I didn't know Dick well enough to have had any glimpse of the background.
So he never personally talked to me about his marriage, and I just thought everything was hunky-dory. Plus, he was married forever and had 4 kids. I was never so shocked in my, to this day. I mean, I just cannot believe it.
As the 70s drew to a close, Dick Van Dyke was sober, and for the first time since he was 23, he was single. When Celebrity Profile continues, a career renaissance, and at home, a new beginning.
She's very good for him.
In 1979, Dick Van Dyke played a priest in a film called The Runner Stumbles. The title seemed an apt metaphor for Van Dyke, who had just ended his 30-year marriage and had quit drinking after a long struggle. He spent much of the 1980s making TV movies and taking it easy.
So I would just take things that came along without actually looking. I was kind of in a half retirement in those days.
Van Dyke had begun seeing Michelle Marvin. They'd met in the late 70s when she worked at the William Morris Agency. She was also a public figure in her own right. As Michelle Triola Marvin, she established the legal precedent of palimony when she sued her former companion, actor Lee Marvin, for support. Comedian Dick Martin is a friend of the couple.
It's very good for him, and because I don't think that Dick would get along in this world too well alone, because he doesn't cook, he doesn't do any of the things at home that, so he needs somebody to take care of him, and Michelle does it beautifully.
In 1988, Van Dyke returned to series television, this time co-starring with son Barry, by then a TV veteran in his own right. The situation comedy was called simply The Van Dyke Show.
What a mistake that was. I wanted so badly to work with my son, and we were always looking for something to work together. And this just seemed like the vehicle, and it wasn't. It wasn't right.
The failed show could not tarnish Van Dyke's status as a TV icon. In 1993, the affection and respect for him were obvious when he received a star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame.
This is the greatest single actor who has ever worked on television in the history of our world. I've said it.
And when you work with a professional, a guy who really knows his business, who on top of it knows your business too. And we love him, and I'm sure you do too, and that's why you're here.
And I just found out that they put me next to Stan Laurel, a man that I admired so much ever since my childhood and got a chance to meet in his later years. And I can't believe it. I didn't know that till I got down here. And I just have, this bow tie was given to me by Stan Laurel. That's why I wore it today. It's the polka dot tie he was movies.
1994 began a new chapter in Van Dyke's life. He returned to series television as Mark Sloan, an eccentric crime-fighting doctor on Diagnosis Murder. Longtime television executive Fred Silverman.
We caught Dick Van Dyke at the right time for this. You know, he'd been lounging around home quite a bit, and I think that he got the itch to work again.
Barry Van Dyke soon came aboard as a police detective who also happens to be Dr. Mark Sloan's son.
It's a whole new guy that he created. It shows a whole new side of him, a wisdom and a seasoning and kind of a warmth that was new. It's a little bit different, and eccentricities, too, that he brought to this character. Grew the mustache for this character. He looks different.
The lighthearted mystery series has also featured other Van Dykes. Daughter Stacy has appeared, and so have 4 of Van Dyke's grandchildren. As an executive producer, Van Dyke has ensured the on-set atmosphere is relaxed and even-keeled. Co-star Charlie Schlaughter.
Dick is so youthful and has such a great energy about him, and he makes you feel so comfortable, and he makes you feel proud of what you do.
Actress Victoria Rowell points to Van Dyke's off-camera friendship and loyalty.
As a person, he is very supportive to all of his cast members, and in particular, he has supported my efforts with foster children on a state and national level, and that means a great deal to me.
The TV veteran has definite ideas on the tone of the show, especially regarding issues of taste.
I'm fighting at what seems to be a winning battle now, and they're agreeing with me that this is that kind of a show. It's a family show. And if not enough people watch it because it's too family, then they'll have to take it off. But that's the way I would like it. I cannot pander so the advertisers can get a rating.
In a moment, a final perspective.
It matters to Dick how much he knows himself, and it's none of my business.
He's the product of small-town America, whose seemingly endless talent took him a very long way. But Dick Van Dyke is a study in contradiction. A warm, good-natured, nice guy who has, at the same time, made himself completely unknowable. Friends call him loyal, modest, affable, and utterly unimpressed with his own celebrity.
He's successful and doesn't want to talk about it. You know, he would rather be by himself. He's very happy at home.
I love the fact he never talks about showbiz. And I think Dick, if he hadn't been an actor, he could have been a doctor or a historian, some kind of professor.
It would be hard to find anyone that didn't like Dick Van Dyke. He's a nice fellow.
When my husband passed away in 1964, very unexpectedly, Dick and Marge were the first people over my house. And they said, come on, take it easy. You know, we're here if you need anything.
I was going through a rather difficult time during the shooting, and he was very warm and supportive and sympathetic.
Few performers command the kind of instant respect that Dick Van Dyke does.
I saw a man perform so brilliantly that it made me cry sometime.
There is nothing that he can't do as a performer. I mean, he sings, he dances, he's a great comedian. You know, he's a very, very fine dramatic actor.
At the same time, this very public man has remained a mystery to practically everyone around him.
I think you got to know him as much by what he wouldn't do and you could kind of piece it together. Well, this must mean this. And, you know, if he didn't analyze himself, everyone who talked to him did.
We're not close. We're not distant or whatever the opposite of close is. We just aren't close. I like him, you know. We don't fight. We just, you know, nobody's close to Dick. My mother, you know, she would hug him and, you know, he would just stand stiff. You know, he would just, he's not a cold person, he's just hard to get to know.
He's a very loving person. I think coming from the background that he did, Danville, Illinois, or wherever, he's not a hugger. Like Carl Reiner's a hugger, I'm a hugger, a lot of guys are hugger, hey, how are you? Maybe growing up in that kind of conservative atmosphere in a small town in Illinois, it wasn't manly to do that.
It matters to Dick how much he knows himself. And it's none of my business. But the persona that I spent time with was a brother, was a treasured person who means something. And that's what's important. It's not that I couldn't get under his skin, you know, I mean, who cares? We're two wounded people, I think. And so I have great empathy for Dick and love.
Ultimately, it's not his guarded nature that will define Van Dyke for generations to come. Rather, it is his work. And with characteristic modesty, Dick Van Dyke seems genuinely surprised that this work has made him a cultural icon.
And it's funny, when you're doing it, either you're proud of what you're doing or whatever, you don't stop to think about, will it have any impact? And then suddenly you find out that a body of work has had a positive impact on people. It's a wonderful feeling. But it's kind of a surprise to me. You don't think about it when you're doing it.